What would you get if you took a southern town affected by a natural disaster and mixed in an unnatural disaster, body horror, and Vietnamese folklore? You get They Bloom at Night, a novel by Trang Thanh Tran that brings a plethora of ideas together in one book with an impressively fluid genre. A little horror, a little fantasy, it even has some mafia tones with the villain. Today I'm reviewing the novel with no spoilers, but I want to give a quick disclaimer. This is just my opinion. If it's different than yours, that doesn't matter. It shouldn't take away from your feelings and enjoyment of the book. In fact, I'd love to hear your differing opinions in the comments. They Bloom at Night follows Noon, a Vietnamese-American teenager living with her mother in Mercy, Alabama. The two are just scraping by in the wake of a hurricane that triggered an immense algae bloom. But while the typical algae bloom is a brief disaster, this one has persisted for 2 years, mutating the sea life and causing many issues. When people start going missing amidst rumors of a monster skulking through Mercy, Noon and her mother are tasked with finding said monster by Jimmy, the corrupt harbor master who holds Mercy in the palm of his hand. Jimmy sends his daughter, Covey, as supervision, and the monster hunt begins. I ultimately gave They Bloom at Night 2 stars on this rating scale. They Bloom at Night has amazing thematic and world-building ideas that blend together multiple genres and themes of identity, healing from trauma, and found family for a conceptually rich novel. But the novel's execution fails to live up to its concepts, with rushed pacing, weak prose, and an unfortunate need to explain itself, ultimately undercutting the novel. The novel's greatest strengths rest within its concepts and how it blends together themes and world building to create a genuinely stunning novel. I bought this book on a whim. I found it on a random list of hot fantasy novels coming out in 2025 or something, which woefully undersells what They Bloom does with its genre. Tran combines multiple genres with a deft hand. You could make strong arguments for this being a fantasy story, a myth, a horror story, or a science fiction story, with the truth being that it exists within all of the above ideas. Condensing those genres into a single work gives the story lots of conceptual depth and makes it much more interesting than would have been had it clung to a single idea. They Bloom takes a similar stance with its themes. Noon and the other primary characters all have different traumas they're attempting to heal from, which are introduced as big revelations, so I won't spoil them, and they're largely well done and cleverly tied to the world building and the circumstances the characters find themselves within. One of the great challenges of speculative fiction is incorporating your world building, and Tran takes the route of heavy thematic symbolism to make character and magic blend into a cohesive unit. Between the genre blending and the clever integration of theme and world building, They Bloom at Night is one of the most inventive stories I've read all year. But ideas aren't enough to make an excellent story. Those ideas need to be executed well, which is where this novel struggles in my mind. The plot itself is paced well. I never felt bored, at least by the events going on in the story, and we learn about big twists and have mysteries resolved at a very reasonable rate. Character relations are a different story. The relationship between Covey and Noon specifically comes together way too fast for my tastes, especially considering the circumstances of their partnership. They become close friends with, one speed bump that's overcome within a few pages. This critique of characters becoming real close real fast applies to most of the relationships built within the found family, and I genuinely wish this book just had another 75 pages of contents to let these relationships mature at a slightly slower rate. With the prose, some of the writing just wasn't up to snuff. The novel uses lots of short, simple sentences, which gives it a strong voice. It's told in Noon's first-person POV, and Noon is a very direct, take-action kind of character, so the brief, clipped sentence structure makes sense at a lot of points. It develops a strong voice and gives us a good sense of Noon's perspective. However, the writing occasionally verges too simplistic. Every chapter has a paragraph that read clunkily because the sentences were all the same length or used the same structure, and there were quite a few passive telling sentences, especially in the first half of the novel, that were just awkward. I'm not saying that every novel needs purple prose, like this is how you lose the Time War, but some of these passages stood out as very unwieldy. That said, I think this was my least pressing issue with the novel, especially compared with the telling. My greatest issue with They Bloom at Night was its need to explain itself, especially when anything thematic or character-related came around. The novel has basically no subtext because every interesting, weighty line of dialogue or thought gets explained right after in the narration. It's frustrating because there's lots of good dialogue, but having every meaningful exchange undercut by Noon telling us how to interpret it slows the pace tremendously. Especially considering that, in most cases, the dialogue was plenty clear. For example, Noon and Covey have an exchange that culminates in Covey saying, "Turn my brain off, please." Covey's dialogue is immediately followed by a paragraph that is just as long as the dialogue, explaining that Covey wants a reprieve. It's perfectly clear from Covey explicitly asking to have her brain turned off for a moment that she wants a reprieve. And the novel does this constantly. The point of view makes it even more jarring. Like I said, this novel is written in the first person, so having Noon tell us exactly what Covey or Jimmy or Wilde will feel is jolting. And it gets especially bad at the end around Jimmy. Jimmy is the villain, and a fairly one-note villain who tells us exactly what he's thinking, which becomes frustrating when compounded by Noon telling us that the mustache-twirling guy who establishes himself as the villain from chapter 3 or so is in fact a shitty guy. This was definitely my biggest issue with the book, and completely responsible for it getting 2 stars instead of 3. They Bloom at Night definitely wasn't my favorite read this year, but I'm still genuinely in awe of how Tran developed their themes. They have another novel out called She is a Haunting that I'm going to read at some point. The themes and world building in their work are spectacular, and I think a slightly more refined novel would be incredible. If you've read They Bloom at Night and you had different thoughts, let me know in the comments, and let me know if you like this sort of short spoiler-free review, or if you'd like to see longer reviews in the future with a section for spoilers to dig deeper into the story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.